merci. Je m'appelle Luiz Amaral. Je suis le CEO de la Science-Based Targets Initiative. Mais malheureusement, ça fait déjà des années que je ne pratique pas mon français. Alors, si c'est bon avec vous, je vais faire la présentation en anglais. Désolé pour ça, mais quand même, j'ai fait une petite introduction en français. Well, thanks everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm Luis, as I said, the CEO for the Science-Based Targets Initiative. The Science-Based Targets Initiative, or the SBTi, started roughly 10 years ago, a little bit before COP21 here in Paris. The original goal of the initiative, when we started a decade ago, more or less, was to get 100 companies here in Paris to commit to set that their corporate climate ambition was aligned to what science told us needed to happen. So the basic idea of a science-based target is not that what we can make it happen, it's what the science and the carbon budget tells us that needs to happen. The idea is, let's look forward and see how much carbon can we have on the world in 5 or 10 years, and then we do the math to see how much we have to decarbonize. And our target, as I said, 10 years ago here in Paris, was to get 100 companies to show that it was possible. Well, today, we have 5,000 companies with targets validated that have actually set their commitments aligned to what science tells us is needed. It's a movement that has started, again, slowly, and is picking up action, and today, we have doubled the number of companies with setting science-based targets every year for the past 5 years. So what started with a ripple is now really a wave. And I'm very happy to be here in Paris again, almost 10 years later, because it's such an important part of this climate movement. France is actually one of the leaders on setting science-based targets compared to the other countries when you look into our numbers. Roughly 88% of the CAC index companies have already either committed or set targets with the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So it's one of the highest penetrations of companies if you look at the highest and the biggest companies in a country. So why do we set science-based targets? Why to set the science-based targets? Why are they so important? Well, my first answer is, if we don't define success from the start, it's very hard to know if we're getting there or if we ever achieve there. If we don't say exactly in standardized ways, where do we need to get, it's very hard to know if you're on track. It's very hard to know if you even got there. And there's a big risk that corporate climate action becomes a storytelling competition. I'm doing X, I'm doing Y. But how do you actually measure everything in a standardized way to know if you're on track? And that's what science-based targets is so important. It helps each company how much and how fast they need to decarbonize to be aligned with the targets that were set here in Paris during the Paris Agreement. There's also a foundation for strategy. You never start a program without knowing where you want to get. And that actually helps to align a whole company around what the objectives are and getting different departments to work together. So for example, we actually asked companies what are the reasons they were setting targets, and they got us 4 answers. One was to showcase their leadership. They want to show that they're serious companies compared to their peers. The second one was to demonstrate their commitments to the cause and their commitments to a net zero world. The third one was because it was aligned to their strategy, and they wanted to align the strategy. And the fourth one, as I said, which I think is one of the most interesting ones, was to catalyze real action inside the company. How by setting those targets, they got different departments working together towards the same goals, from the from the chief sustainability officers to HR to operations. Everybody had a common definition of success. Where should they be heading? And that had an important role. I have one example of one company I heard from a C-suite executive of one large cement company that told me that originally when SBTi started, we have different levels of ambition, and we would accept targets that were aligned to 2-degree world, and they set that 2.0 target way back then. And as they did that, the whole company started to move forward, and they actually said, you know what? We can do better, we can do faster. They came back and updated their target to 1.5, and the reason this C-suite executive told me was because having that goal, having the whole company rowing together to the same direction, actually helped them to align the departments and show them that they could go faster and further. But today I want to talk to you about, but not everything is easy, right? Obviously, we know it's one of the hardest challenges that we have, and we do know that there are difficulties when you're setting and implementing targets. And I want to talk to you about two key areas which we're seeing where progress needs to be made as well. Well, first, the name of this conference is really, really important, ChangeNOW. I'm here today not to talk about the past, not to talk about the distant future as well, but to talk what we need to be doing now, because action now is what we need. What can we make it today to help us get further and further closer to our objectives of the future? As I said, we now have more than 5,000 companies with targets validated. Out of those 5,000 companies, 700 companies have already set net zero targets. So we have two levels of targets. We have the short-term targets, and then we have the long-term net zero target, which is the hardest level of ambition. Some of those companies that have set the highest level of ambition, the net zero target for the long term, for example, are Capgemini, Rémy Cointreau, Sodexo, Schneider Electric, just to name a few of the large French companies. And the number of companies setting net zero targets as well has doubled every year for the past 3 years. But it's true, and we see by the numbers, that companies are doing better on their shorter term and are setting more shorter term targets than long-term targets. The conclusion of a campaign that we did showed that 84% of the companies that actually committed to setting science-based targets set a short-term target, where only 60% set a long-term one. And some media has actually said that demonstrated a little bit of evidence of lacking of ambition on how 1.5 was backsliding. I want to make a counter-argument. I would want to say that actually getting on track on the shorter term is as important as having a long-term ambition. We want to increase the ambition and get companies into a net zero path as well, but if they are on their path on the shorter term, I'll take that as a win, because they are on the path to getting them to the net zero world that we need to get in 20, 30 years from now. And why? Why are they focusing on the shorter term? Because they're getting the easier thing, they're doing the easier things first. It's much easier for you to identify what you need to do in the next 3 years because it's closer and usually going for the low-hanging fruits. When it comes to the longer-term targets, it's a little bit more challenged because we don't have all the answers. We don't know exactly how we're going to get there. And there are 3 things that companies told us that we're working on to try to facilitate that, how to increase the knowledge and make it easier to set the longer-term net zero targets. One, and the biggest elephant in the room, is Scope 3 emissions. We heard that from 50% of the companies, knowing what to do and tackling Scope 3 emissions was the hardest challenge, because the truth is, we don't have all the answers yet. Nobody has all the answers yet. Yet, we also do know that we are not going to win the fight on climate change if you're not tackling Scope 3 emissions. They are on average about 11% higher than the emissions inside the company. So if there anybody here that is not aware with the jargon, but Scope 3 are basically the emissions on your supply chain. You have the emissions on your own operations, which is Scope 1, emissions of your energy-related emissions, which is Scope 2, and then your supply chain emissions, which is Scope 3. And on average, that's 11 times higher than your internal emissions. So we need to tackle Scope 3 if you are to tackle climate change. But we do know that it's hard. But there are things that can be done. First, we need to recognize that not all Scope 3 emissions are created equal. There are very different ways of tackling. Your level of influence varies a lot depending on which company you are, depending on where you are in the supply chain, depending on which sector or industry you're at. There are the upstream supply chain emissions, so the emissions that come from the materials that you buy, and the downstream supply chain, so the emissions that come from the materials that you sell or the products that you sell. And there are different strategies to deal with those. If you're dealing with the materials that you sell, usually you have to make your materials or products or services better. Think about a car. You need to make your car more energy efficient using new types of fuels. That's how you tackle Scope 3 downstream emissions. But how to tackle Scope 3 upstream emissions, which is usually what folks say is one of the difficult challenges. Well, there's one way which there are companies that have been experimenting with and we have been supporting, which is usually the easiest and the fastest way just to get the ball moving, which is supplier engagement. If we believe the 80-20% rule that usually applies for most of the things that we do in businesses, I can bet that 20% of your suppliers probably represent about 80% of your emissions, on average, give and take. So it means that if you're you don't have to start tackling 100% of your supply chain, but if you're focusing on those biggest most important suppliers, you're already promoting the systemic changes that are needed. We have set programs with companies, and it's part of target setting with SBTi that you have a method which is choosing to engage your suppliers. If you're engaging your suppliers and they're setting their targets, you're promoting the transformation change up your supply chain as well that is needed. If your suppliers are decarbonizing, well, guess what? Your supply chain is decarbonizing. Your Scope 3 emissions are also going to go down with time. It's a good business strategy as well. We have worked with a few companies that have engaged with their suppliers, that have created seminars and engagement work with them, that have demonstrated how it's important as well to, one, get to know your suppliers for other business reasons, two, increase the relationship and the quality of the relationship with the suppliers, because that's actually good business too. So I urge folks, when they're lost on their supply chain challenges and lost on what to do in Scope 3, well, think about it. How can we start there? Maybe we can start there. Start bringing your suppliers in, because that's the first thing that we can do. But then we recognize that that is not enough, that there may be other Scope 3 challenges, there are other data challenges, and that data is a difficult thing as well. Well, I heard also from some C-suite executives that sometimes told me, Luiz, this SBTi thing that folks are doing is just so complicated. You should make it as easy as it is to do a balance sheet of a company, right? A financial balance sheet. Well, it's true. That's what we're trying to recreate here. But I answered back and knowing to say, oh, did you know that the first standards for financial disclosure are from the late 1800s? That it took 100 years to get where we are? That there are 4 million folks that go to grad school and study for 4 years accounting, financial accounting. So it looks easy to do a financial balance sheet because it took 100 years, and there are 4 million folks that go for 4 years of grad school to make that. So we're trying to recreate the same thing with carbon. It's true, but we don't have 100 years. And that's what we're trying to do. But data is still a challenge because we're not there yet. We have to train the folks. We have to have the carbon specialists. We have to create the standards as we're doing in SBTi, but we have to create the data as well because it's not all available. And one of the reasons that we urge companies to do as well is you don't manage what you don't measure. So the first step of the journey is doing your carbon accounting. And everybody has to do that to get their start of their journey. But the more they bring others in, the more folks are in doing their carbon accounting and disclosing their numbers, the easier it gets for everyone. So the data challenge is when you're bringing your suppliers, also engage them to do their math, to do their data collection, to do their reporting. Because the more folks collect and report the data is available, and the easier it is for everybody to move from just do the supplier engagement to actually start to measure progress with Scope 3 emissions. For example, an expiring example is a collaboration of a sector of consortium companies in the UK of food retailers, Aldi, Co-op, Lidl, M&S, Morrison, Sainsbury, Tesco, and Waitrose, which was supported by some of our partners like RAP and WWF, which worked together to standardize measurements and reporting of greenhouse gas emissions on their suppliers, focus on food and drink. Another example of this collaborative approach to tackle data in supply chains is a collaboration between IKEA, Philips, ZF, and Unilever, which is, again, is aimed on collecting, acting, and reducing supply chain Scope 3 emissions. Improving data is a challenge. We have to all work on that. It's not the only thing that prevents action, but it's one that we need to work together. But it will be a major step in overcoming challenges with Scope 3, but it will also be instrumental in better baselining and better alignment of action across the supply chains. So we discussed Scope 3 and how to deal with that, get going by engaging suppliers. The second on promoting data collection and disclosure and transparency, because the more in, the easier it gets for everyone. And the third point that I just wanted to make today is that we obviously will always start with the low-hanging fruit, right? What is, as I said, 20% of the suppliers probably get 80% of the emissions. If you're doing your own abatement cost curves inside your company, you probably start with the things that have a negative cost, in which you're going to save money by doing it. And then you go to the things that are lower cost to get, but there always be the things that are more difficult. So my third call for today is, let's already act today on the easy things, but think today on how we're going to tackle the difficult things. And SBTi we like to focus on the hard stuff first. Because if you're really going to transform how business is done, we need to do that at a systemic level. The next area of climate action will not pick the low-hanging fruits alone, but will get stuck on the naughtiest, heaviest challenges. For example, this is one of the reasons why we're developing sector-specific guidance for the hard-to-abate sectors, the hardest sectors that need to change if we're going to change the world. Because they have systemic consequences. If you decarbonize things like steel or cement, you're impacting the auto industry, you're impacting the building industry. If you are decarbonizing energy, you're impacting everybody else. So we need to think what the systemic changes are. And we're trying to do that by going hard and trying to bring in the hard-to-abate sectors. My ask for companies is think about that in-house as well. What are the hardest challenges for the business model? Once you get rid of the low-hanging fruits, what are the high-hanging fruits? How are you going to be tackling those? What are the business models that need to be different? What are the different supply chains that need to be different once you get there? Don't wait until tomorrow. Start now thinking how you're going to tackle those hardest systemic challenges later on. So to conclude, as I said, there's reason to hope because we're seeing systemic global changes. The changes that we're seeing for SBTi is not linear anymore, it's exponential growth, doubling the number of companies involved every year. At COP, just last year, we were at 4,000 companies. 2.5 months later, we're now at 5,000 companies, which was linear transformation. Hopefully, we're starting to see exponential one. But that is not enough. We need more and more folks in. Collaboration will be key on all of those challenges that we have. For Scope 3, it will require companies to join forces with others, to bring their suppliers in. For data improvements, we need to get more transparent, more folks in, and disclosing and collecting data because it gets easier for everyone. And for tackling the hard stuff, we need to act now and thinking how to change business models and systemic changes that will be needed in maybe not today, but in 5 years on your businesses if you're really going to start to get to the net zero world once you have got and done the easier stuff. But as I said, at the foundation of all of that to start to change, we need ambition, we need leadership, and we need clear definition of success. I'll start by telling a very quick story why the science-based targets and setting an ambition, which is in a standardized way, is so important and why business leaders should do that. When JFK Kennedy made the famous speech on the 60s that we will get by the moon by the end of the decade, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Well, they didn't have all the technology to get to the moon at the time. But yet, 10 years later, they were landing on the moon. It took courage, and it took this very clear definition of success from a leader that actually then gave the conditions to folks to work on it to actually get to the objectives that they were. Half of the Apollo 11 engineers were still in high school when Kennedy made their famous speech. But by giving a very clear definition of success in the future, creating the conditions for your company, or in that case, for a country, to actually work on this, actually created the conditions that got us and that got humanity on the moon. So my ask is, business leaders, do what it takes, create the conditions, set very clear ambitions, set the target, create the conditions for your folks to work on, your apartments will align, and we are going to get the results that we all need. Thank you very much and look forward for the discussions.